In this podcast, I'm going to be revealing to you the evidence collected over 20 years confirming the key players that were behind the establishment of Cercle and 6I, which was a private intelligence security group that could spy on all nations and avoid any legislation of the USA, Australia, Canada or UK or Europe in order to be able to carry out their subversive activities, and particularly propaganda, to ensure that governments that are leaning to the right are democratically elected, and it's all in the name of fighting communism. The key part to this is that there was a secret Catholic group within the Catholic Church known as Sint Unam, and it was financed and led by Carlo Presenti in Italy, who was a owner of large Italian banks and was financing the creation of Cercle and 6I, and became a member of the Trilateral Commission by the endorsements of Henry Kissinger and billionaire David Rockefeller. He was linked to neo-fascist and neo-Nazi terrorist groups. He was financing them, which I'll reveal to you. But more important, the financing and creation of Cercle and 6I, which started in the 1970s under Vernon Walters, who was Deputy Director of CIA. It had the support of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who founded the Trilateral Commission with David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, and Carlo Presenti. More importantly, I'm going to show you the history of the support of William Wilson, who was the ambassador to the Vatican, Alexander Haig, and importantly, Michael Ledeen, who's an advisor to both Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley. This Cercle, 6I, was predominantly run by Ted Shackley. And the reason for its creation, particularly with a secret Catholic organisation called Sint Unam, was really under the guise of fighting communism, particularly in Poland, and hence the importance of Ted Shackley, whose roots of his family are Polish. He speaks Polish and was previously working for OSSS, and particularly for the debriefing of Nazi officers in Poland. So his key role is because of Ronald Reagan's support for a holy alliance with the Vatican, and it's been hijacked by the neocons and Ted Shackley as a vehicle for funding arms and drugs internationally for supporting fascist organisations throughout the 1970s, 1980s and into the early 1990s. But the key part to this is it's an alliance of Opus Dei, the Knights of Malta, represented by Crown Prince Otto Habsburg from Austria, as the founder of Cercle and 6I, but the vehicle for money laundering is the Vatican Bank and Banca Ambrosiana, led by Archbishop Paul Masinkas, Robert Calvi, known as God's Banker, and Michael Sindona, with Banca Ambrosiana and the Franklin Bank, and they are all members of P2 Lodge, and so was Alexander Haig and Henry Kissinger. And their links with Lucia Jalli, whose links to neo-Nazi fascist organisations and Mussolini, with the P2 Lodge. And so the evidence is overwhelming that Michael Ledeen opened the door for Ted Shackley with Lucia Jalli in order for him to come to White House to meet with Alexander Haig and other White House officials in the early 80s. And so we're going to take you through this journey. In addition to that, I'm going to present to you that the Cercle 6I was hijacked and controlled eventually by the neocons who take over all America. And of course it includes Henry Kissinger, Svev Kramer, the son of Fritz Kramer, who recruited Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, and Michael Ledeen. These are key people who are upset about my research into the PROMIS software affair when I was contacted by William Hamilton in 2004 and advised that Paul Wolfowitz was leading the charge to discredit my research into PROMIS software. And then I was also approached by Robert Booth Nichols in Australia with threats made against my life that I was upsetting some very powerful Israeli businessmen and that all my problems lead to Alexander Haig. And isn't it interesting that my evidence of the PROMIS software being used for NATO, Strategic Defence Initiative, the Star Wars program, with AWACS, nuclear Trident submarines, and infiltration of all the banking networks with the SWIFT networks, with Citibank, World Bank, IMF and the Club of Rome banks, represented by Henry Kissinger, and Paul Wolfowitz at the time was being nominated as the president of the World Bank by President George W. Bush in early 2005. So we are going to present to you conclusive evidence that the Knights of Malta, the propaganda duo P2 Masonic Lodge, represented by Lucia Jalli, and also Opus Dei, have amalgamated in their holy alliance with CIA and the Vatican Bank, with Paul Masinkas, Robert Calvi and Mikhail Sindona, or financed by a person known as Carlo Presenti, who supports and finances neo-Nazi, neo-fascist organisations and is the founder of Cercle and also 6I. And the laundering goes through Banca Ambrosiano, through to Nugenhan Bank and through to BCCI and Citibank with Project Hammer. I'm going to also provide overwhelming evidence that the founders of the Trilateral Commission, Henry Kissinger, Brzezinski and David Rockefeller, invite Carlo Presenti to join and found the Trilateral Commission, which is advised by Kissinger and Associates and Frank Colucci's Kyle Group in terms of policy program worldwide. And then I will present to you in this podcast the overwhelming evidence of the links of Alexander Haig, David Kennedy, And whilst Stanfield Turner is implicated, he's not guilty, but is aware of the CIA with Secretary of State Alexander Haig directly involved with Banca Ambrosiana Overseas Limited in Nassau for the laundering of arms and drugs through Banca Ambrosiana Overseas Limited. It's the laundering of the Gambino heroin from Sicily into New York with CIA, endorsed and condoned as part of their international funding of arms and propaganda support for militant fascist countries such as Chile, Bolivia, Nicaragua, and also right through South America and Thailand with Ted Shackley's links with the mafia. In the name of the Holy Crusaders in previous podcasts, it reinforces the overwhelming evidence that the Sovereign Knights of Malta, together with Wackel, with John Singlaub, together with Peter Grace and Mary Cares, together with Richard Vigory with the Council for National Policy, together with Pat Robertson and the Moonies, the far right, and the Ned Endowment Democracy, the CIA had established international foundations that allowed them to money launder the drugs and arms in the name of God, disguised as aid. It's overwhelming evidence that links back to the evidence of BCCI, $250 million linked to Noriega's drugs through Capcom, Securities and Chicago Stock Board, directly linked to Pat Robertson's Christian Broadcast Network. Also directly linked with Peter Grace, but I will show you that it was the efforts of Ted Shackley, George Bush Sr., William Casey, Oliver North, Richard Secor, John C. Laban, laundering the funds under the guise of the Sovereign Knights of Malta, which has the ability to provide diplomatic pouches and transfer and passports in the name of the Vatican in order to clear customs without drugs and money laundering being detected. In a future podcast, I will show the definitive evidence of the CIA's alliance with Roy Frankhauser and the Ku Klux Klan and the American Nazi Party for laundering $8 billion of cocaine hidden in Siemens transformers through BCCI involving Oliver North, Dwayne Claridge, and I'll even provide evidence that Roy Frankhauser even had an office in Langley working with the Counter-Terrorism Centre. In previous podcasts, I have shown that Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein and Ed Wilson, together with Richard Secord, Eric von Mambod, and Michael Ledeen. Remember the name Michael Ledeen? He pops up everywhere in this podcast. They had established Eastco and a propaganda company, together with Gray & Co., with Robert Gray, Robert Owen, Neil Livingston and Joseph Capucini, were directly involved with Earl Bryan's companies, Operational Systems Inc., migrated into Simcom Inc., and Hadron Inc., and they developed the whole safe CIA, DIA safe software, which was released as Iris with banking software to all the Club of Rome's banks with Robert Gray and Henry Kissinger associates, in order to infiltrate the SWIFT networks worldwide, but also allow them to launder drugs and arms through Guggenheim Bank, Banco Ambrosiana and BCCI, and the Club of Rome banks worldwide without detection, and also had infiltrated and placed Lucien Koenig in intelligence for DEA, so that they were able, it was basically the fox looking after the chicken coop, the whole war on drugs and terrorism program. It was their fusion software and intelligence software that they owned and controlled, and were aware of all investigations being undertaken by the Department of Justice and FBI, so they could avoid prosecutions. I also showed that they had infiltrated and developed the Aerostat, AWAC, Integrated Command Control Systems, which was used as the War on Drugs and the Drug Interdiction Program, and this allowed them to provide intelligence and also capabilities for sanctioned CIA and the secret teams, drug ships, and also aircraft to avoid detection, by providing them with the appropriate ability to be able to detect radar and also avoid detection, and provide them with sanctioned security identification that allows them to fly as an official national security operation crafts that avoids any detection and seizure of drugs. So they had infiltrated the drug databases. They controlled the Department of Defense C3 command control and intelligence systems, Pathfinder, which was doing the tracking of all intelligence of cars, license plates, ID, and also ships, planes, of transport of drugs, and the whole integrated systems of drug detection and money laundering. So the fox was looking after the chicken coop. Back in 2004, when I interviewed Michael Riconosciuto and contacted him in prison for the first time, he sent letters to me confirming the first application of PROMIS was for NATO and US Navy for the modified PROMIS software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines. And so this was integrated into the complete NATO command control systems for tracking Soviet missiles and submarines, which was part of their simulation program for the whole of NATO in Europe, particularly fighting the Warsaw Pact. The second application, Michael confirmed, was that the modified PROMIS software for CIA was put into SWIFT banking, and it was first installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, and that Dr. Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, would allow them to move covert funds through international automatic clearing houses without being detected. And of course, previous podcasts I've confirmed evidence of Project Hammer by General Earl Cockey, who was representative of Guggenheim Bank in Washington, confirming that it was being used, Project Hammer was being used for movement of gold bullion and US security notes internationally across all borders with CIA. The other part of the evidence that I will reveal is that the evidence of Danny CASOLARO, he was definitely, unequivocally investigating the evidence of the BCCI checks involving Robert Sensi. And this is the reason he was murdered. I will prove to you beyond doubt that the Cercle 6i and the whole secret Catholic Church organisation, the fascist group that was involved with fighting communism in Poland, was the same group that was involved in the sale of drugs and arms for Iran-Contra, and in partnership with the mafia, the Gambino mafia, in Sicily and also in New York. And Robert Sensi testifies that he worked for the Kuwait royal family that financed the BCCI checks. He also worked with William Wilson, who was the ambassador to the Vatican, William Casey, who was liaising with the Pope directly as CIA's collaboration with the Vatican to fight communism in Poland. He was also working for Robert Gray, who financed Iris Corporation and also owned Eastco and Consultants International with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Michael Ledeen and co. And he also worked for Clint Murchison, who was a director of Fidco that Michael was involved with Robert Booth Nichols. Hence the coincidences of Robert Booth Nichols appearing with Michael Ledeen on the same day to make threats against me, saying that I'm upsetting powerful Israeli businessmen, and my problems lead to Alexander Haig, given my research into the PROMIS scandal. And I also received confirmation from William Hamilton that he's just been advised from a Pentagon spy that my research into PROMIS software has upset Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and also Douglas Faith and Scooter Libby. So, let's now go to the story and the evidence of the fight against communist subversion within the Catholic Church and a secret group called Sint Unum Plan. And it's from the memorandum of Henry Kissinger for President Nixon in the 70s, given he's received intelligence from David Rockefeller, who's in partnership and joining the Cercle 6I with Carlos Presenti. So, in 2001, Time magazine presented a cover story called The Holy Alliance by Carl Bernstein. And whilst I read this out, it's important that I've highlighted the key things that I want you to focus on. President Reagan and Pope John Paul II were present in Vatican Library on Monday, June the 7th of 1982. It was a time for the two had met, and they talked for 50 minutes in the same wing of the papal apartments. Agostino Cardinal Casolaro and Archbishop Arcali Silvestrini met with Secretary of State Alexander Haig and Judge William Clark, Reagan's National Security Advisor. Most of the discussion focused on Israel's invasion of Lebanon. This is very important because this was the beginning of the PROMIS software with AWACS and drones in the battle where they destroyed all the MiG fighters, and it was the proof of the power of the PROMIS software integration with AWACS and drones. Then in the second day, Haig told them Prime Minister Menachem Begin had assured him that the invasion would not go further than 25 miles inside Lebanon. But Reagan and the Pope spent only a few minutes reviewing events in the Middle East. Instead, they remained focused on the subject much closer to their heart, Poland. And so in my previous podcast, that PROMIS software was used by William Casey for economic warfare against the Soviet Union, which bankrupted them through the banks and also blocked all Western technologies being sold, was using the PROMIS software, is relevant to this story, and Poland and the Soviet dominance of the Eastern Europe. In that meeting, Reagan and the Pope agreed to undertake a clandestine campaign to hasten the dissolution of the communist regime empire, declares Richard Allen, Reagan's first national security advisor. This was one of the great secret alliances of all time. And so, as we read this story, Reagan came in very simple and strongly held views, says Admiral Bobby Inman, former Deputy Director of CIA. And remember, he owned a company, ISC, with Alexander Haig that was caught up in the export scandal of electronic devices relevant to missiles and technologies that were possibly being sold to South Africa and the Soviet Union. This is important. It's a valid point of view that he saw the collapse of communism coming and he pushed it hard. During the first half of 1982, a 5-part strategy emerged that was aimed at bringing the collapse of the Soviet economy, fraying the ties that bound the USSR to the client states in Warsaw Pact and forcing reform inside the Soviet Empire. Elements of the strategy included US defence build-up already underway, aimed at making it too costly for the Soviets to compete militarily with the US Reagan Strategic Defence Initiative. Star Wars became a centrepiece. And my previous podcasts, I confirmed to you that Chuck Missler was a director of Hadron Inc. and then became a director of Halionetics with William Simon and Robert Gray. And these are key players in all of the components that I'll be talking about today. Covert operations aimed at encouraging reform movements in Hungary, Czechoslovakia and Poland, and financial aid to Warsaw Pact nations calibrated to their willingness to protect human rights and undertake political and free reforms through sanctions, and then economic isolation of the Soviet Union. So this is where the sanctions step in with the use of the PROMIS software to control the banks, particularly monitor all SWIFT transactions of trade, export-imports of the Soviet Union, and also the acquisition of Western and Japanese technology from Moscow. The administration focused on denying USSR what it hoped would be the principal source hard currency in the 21st century. Profits from transcontinental pipeline to supply natural gas to Western Europe. The 3,600-mile-long pipeline stretching from Siberia to France opened on January 1st, 1984, but on a far smaller scale than the Soviets had hoped. And then propaganda. Increased use of Radio Liberty, Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe to transmit the administration's message to the peoples of Eastern Europe. And so this is a key component of the Cercle. The 6th I is propaganda. The operation was focused on Poland. And so the evidence is overwhelming that the original application and critical need for PROMIS software to infiltrate the banks, track technologies, and also be used for NATO for tracking missiles on Trident submarines with AWACS and also ships in a sophisticated NATO network is actually the instigation of this alliance with the Catholic Church. And so Poland, the most populous of the Soviet satellites of Eastern Europe and the birthplace of John Paul II. Both the Pope and the President were convinced that Poland could be broken out of the Soviet orbit if the Vatican and the US committed their resources to destabilizing the Polish government and keeping the outlawed Solidarity movement alive after the declaration of martial law in 1981. And hence, this is William Casey's baby. His expertise with OSS is in economic warfare. Until Solidarity's legal status was restored in 1989, it flourished underground, supplied, nurtured and advised large-level network established under the auspices of Reagan and John Paul II. tons of equipment, fax machines, the first in Poland, printing presses, transmitters, telephones, shortwave radios, video cameras, photocopiers, telex machines, computers and word processors were smuggled into Poland via channels established by priests and American agents and the representatives of the AFL and CIO union, which was heavily aligned with CIA, and the European labour movements. Money for the banned union came from CIA funds, the National Endowment for Democracy. Hence, this is the vehicle that Rupert Murdoch, who had the PROMIS software to be integrated with artificial intelligence, had agreed to finance with Walter Remand and also with William Casey. And they also established secret accounts in the Vatican, hence the Vatican Bank, and Western trade unions. Shortly after Polish security forces moved into the streets, Reagan called the Pope for his advice. At a series of meetings over the next few days, Reagan discussed his options. We had a massive row in Cabinet and the National Security Council about putting together a menu of counteractions. Former Secretary of State Haig recalls they arranged from sanctions. They ranged from sanctions that would have been crushing in their impact on Poland to talking so tough that we would have risked creating another situation like Hungary in 1956 or Czechoslovakia in 1968. This is the key part. Haig dispatched Ambassador-at-Large Vernon Walters. And it turns out that Vernon Walters is a devout Roman Catholic. He's also a member of the Sovereign Knights of Malta to meet with John Paul II. Walters arrived in Rome soon after and met separately with the Pope and with Cardinal CASOLARO, the Vatican Secretary of State. Both sides agreed the Solidaritari's flame must not be extinguished, that the Soviets must become the focus of an international campaign of isolation, and that the Polish government must be subjected to both moral and limited economic pressure. According to US intelligence sources, the Pope had already advised Walensky through church channels to keep his movement operating underground and to pass the word to Solidaritari's 10 million members not to go into the streets and risk provoking Warsaw Pact intervention on civil war with Polish security forces. Because the communists had cut the direct phone lines between Poland and the Vatican, John Paul II communicated with Joseph Cardinal Glemp in Warsaw via radio. He also dispatched his envoys to Poland to report on the situation. The Vatican's information was absolutely better and quicker than ours in every respect, says Alexander Haig. Though we had some excellent sources of our own, our information was taking too long to filter through the intelligence bureaucracy. In the first hours of the crisis, Reagan ordered that the Pope receive as quickly as possible relevant American intelligence, including information from a Polish Deputy Minister of Defense, who was secretly reporting to CIA. Washington also handed over to the Vatican reports and analysis from Colonel Ryszard Kutlinski, a senior member of the Polish General Staff who was a CIA informant until November 1981, when he had to be smuggled out of Poland after he warned that the Soviets were prepared to invade if Polish government did not impose martial law. Kalinski had issued a similar warning about Soviet military action in late 1980, which led the outgoing Carter administration to send secret messages to Leonid Brezhnev, informing him that among the costs of an invasion would be the sale of sophisticated US weapons to China. This time, Kalinski reported to Washington, Brezhnev had grown more impatient and a disastrous harvest at home meant that the Kremlin did not need merchandised army units to help bring in the crops and instead would spare them for an invasion. Anything that we knew that we thought the Pope would not be aware of. We certainly brought it to his attention, says Reagan, and, quote, immediately. So we have overwhelming evidence of the need for intelligence, economic warfare, William Casey, and incorporating all the Knights of Malta within the CIA. And what's very important is this crisis in Poland elevates Ted Shackley to a centre role. He speaks Polish, he worked for OSS, he debriefed all the Nazis in Poland, and so he becomes a key player in this initiative by William Casey with the support of Vice President Bush. And they now establish their Catholic team. And I'm going to prove to you that this Catholic team, in the name of a holy alliance, are all the people behind Iran-Contra, the arms and drugs that were laundered through Nugenhan Bank, Banca Ambrosiana, BCCI, and Project Hammer Citibank that had the PROMIS software installed within the SWIFT networks. The key administration players were all devout Roman Catholics. Centre stage was CIA Chief William Casey, Richard Allen, Clark, Alexander Haig, Vernon Walters, and William Wilson. And I want you to focus on William Wilson as the ambassador to the Vatican. Reagan's first ambassador to the Vatican. They regarded the US-Vatican relation as a holy alliance. The moral force of the Pope and the teachings of the Church combined with their fierce anti-communism and their notion of American democracy. Aren't they noble values when you sell arms and drugs to fascist dictators worldwide? Yet the mission would have been impossible without the full support of Reagan, who believed fervently in both the benefits and practical applications of Washington's relation with the Vatican. One of the earliest goals, as President Reagan says, was to recognize the Vatican as a state and make them an ally. According to Admiral John Poindexter, the military assistant to the National Security Advisor, when martial law was declared in Poland, Reagan was convinced that the communists had made a huge miscalculation. After allowing Solidarity to operate openly for 16 months before the crackdown, the Polish government would only alienate its countrymen by attempting to cripple the labour movement, and most importantly would bring the powerful church into direct conflict with the Polish regime. I didn't think that the decision to impose martial law and crush Solidarity, could stand because of the history of Poland and the religious aspect and all. Reagan says, Cardinal Casaroli, there was a real coincidence of interest between the US and the Vatican. And so, US Ambassador to the Vatican, William A. Wilson. And he is a key player now in all the evidence that Danny CASOLARO was investigating over the BCCI checks, the Iran-Contra, payments with the Kuwait royal family, the arms, and also the drugs. William Wilson was a long-time friend and political advisor to President Reagan when he was named the President's personal envoy to the Vatican in 1981. 3 years later, when Congress repealed an 1867 law prohibiting full diplomatic relations with the Holy See, Wilson's position was elevated to that of ambassador. He served the post until May 1986, when he resigned to return to private life. So the key part here is William Wilson is a member of the Sovereign Knights of Malta, and he's now the President Reagan's personal envoy to the Vatican. So why is this important? Well, Robert Sensi worked for Kuwait royal family, William Wilson, Robert Gray, William Casey and Clint Murchison. And this was the key evidence that Danny CASOLARO in his investigations of the PROMIS software and the Iran-Contra BCCI checks involving Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, Manichek Gorbanafar, Adnan Khashoggi and the Kuwait royal family had in his possession when he was found dead with multiple slashes to both of his wrists. He was investigating Robert Sensi. Robert Sensi says he worked for Robert Carter and was also a consultant for the powerful Washington lobbying firm Robert Gray Limited, known for its close ties to the administration, US intelligence bodies. And in November 1983, Robert Owen, an aide to then Senator Dan Quayle, and Oliver North, cooperated with the Contra supply operation, began working for Gray and Co. to improve the image of the Contras in Congress. Robert Sensi says Gray was also the chief lobbyist for the Kuwait government to encourage the US to go to war in the Persian Gulf in November and December 1990. This is critical evidence of how important the evidence of the BCCI checks involving William Wilson, Ted Shackley, William Casey, Robert Gray, Clint Murchison and the Kuwait royal family is, and the motivation for murdering Danny CASOLARO. The Washington Post also says that Robert Sensi's testimony of details of his involvement with the 1983 CIA operation on Iran moderates. A former Washington sales manager for Kuwait Airways testified in court yesterday that he and two Iranian exiles approached CIA officials in early 1983 about a plan to gain influence with moderate factions in Iran and that they undertook such an operation for the CIA later in the same year. Robert Mario Sensi testified that so-called Iran initiative operated for nearly 3 years and ultimately involved several influential Republicans with ties to White House, including the Director of Central Intelligence William Casey and longtime aide to Casey Robert Carter and US Ambassador to the Vatican William Wilson. A search on Robert S. Carter confirms that he was definitely high up in the Republican funding operation for Gerald Ford, George Bush, Ronald Reagan, and had direct interface and liaison with William Casey. So it says here, 1976 under Gerald Ford, he was the treasurer of the Republican National Convention. I then found his complete resume in other documents when he was appointed in special positions by Ronald Reagan. Since 1966, Mr. Carter has been president of Robert S. Carter Associates, a Washington-based public relations and consulting firm. Prior to that, he was the president of Oil and Gas Ventures in New Jersey and later became Director of Public Affairs of Continental Airlines. Mr. Carter was also very active in politics, having served as the executive assistant to the chairman of the Republican National Committee from 1953 to 1957, and in 1964 he served as the chief sergeant-at-arms at the Republican Convention in San Francisco. Again, at the 1968 convention, was responsible for the communications and transportation for Governor Rockefeller. At the primary in 1970, Mr. Carter was elected Republican National Committee man for the District of Columbia and later formally elected at Miami Convention. In 1974, he was appointed by the chairman Bush, our George Bush Sr., to the bipartisan committee to study methods of financing quadrennial national nomination convention. Mr. Carter is single and resides in Washington, D.C. So he was working as a personal aide to William Casey and working directly with Robert Sensi. Robert Sensi also goes on to say, as part of the agreement in the current trial, Sensi will not discuss the names or code names of CIA officials he dealt with or reveal the exact details of the meetings or call CIA officials as witnesses. The government has stipulated or acknowledged that Sensi had a relationship with the CIA from December 1983 until August 1986. The government also acknowledged that Sensi met with Casey at the CIA on June 9th, 1983, along with Robert Carter. Carter testified Monday that the meeting concerned Sensi's plan to travel with one of the Iranian exiles, Habib Moallem, to Tehran and meet with Ayatollah Khomeini. The main company, Alpine Impex, was set up in Washington but later moved to London and served as Moallem's base of operations. Sensi's attorney, Stephen Salzberg, said in his opening statement that Moallem's family was long-time ties to Ayatollah Khomeini and that some of Moallem's relatives gave religious training to Khomeini. So we have overwhelming evidence of the links of Robert Sensi, William Wilson as the ambassador to the Pope, William Casey, Robert Gray, and Clint Murchison. Robert Sensi also testified that again yesterday, that his opening of the bank account known by the last three digits as 640 account was authorized by the former Kuwaiti ambassador Khalid Jaffer, and that his use of the account for CIA-related was authorized by Sheikh Jaber Athbi Al-Sabah, deputy chairman of the Kuwait Airline, who is also the country's chief of civil aviation, so a member of the Al-Sabah Kuwait royal family. Robert Sensi testified he believed that the Kuwait officials pressed charges against him because Sheikh Jaber Athbi Al-Sabah was angered at Sensi's well-published role in negotiations by Muhammad Ali, the boxer, with Israelis concerning the hostages taken from TW Flight 842 in June 1984. This proved embarrassing because Kuwait does not have diplomatic relations with Israel. By late 1984, Robert Sensi and others testified that William Wilson, the ambassador of the Vatican, met with Moallem in Rome to discuss the Iran operation in anticipation of Wilson's briefing President Reagan on it during their annual Christmas visits to Palm Springs, California, estate of Walter Annenberg. A tentative meeting with Vice President Bush was also scheduled, but later cancelled. Sensi and others testified because one of the persons who was to attend, international arms trader Jens Jensen, please remember that name, became embroiled in a scandal about the sale of tow missiles to Iran. Sensi testified that he met with CIA officials from 70 to 80 times. Isn't that amazing? It's not just once, it's over 70 to 80 times. Sources said Casey at one point directed Robert Sensi to go to Tehran, and that Sensi had obtained a visa for the journey, but that trip was called off. Sensi's testimony is the first indication that the Kuwaiti government may have played a role in the US efforts to establish contacts with moderate Iranians. The alleged operation also appears to have come about a year before it was acknowledged overtures to the Iranians by the former National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane. And so we go on. Sensi also testified that he was involved in a second project with CIA that was aimed at persuading the government of Sierra Leone to allow secret US satellite tracking stations to be placed there. Robert Sensi said that he worked with Clint Murchison Jr., who's the director of FIDCO with Robert Booth Nichols, George Pender and Robert Mayhew, the late owner of the Cowboys, on the project that would have replaced tracking stations in Liberia that the United States feared would have to be abandoned as a result of Sergeant Samuel K. Doe's successful coup in 1980. So we now find there is intimate links between Ted Shackley, William Wilson, Khashoggi, Gorbanafar, Robert Gray, William Casey, Clint Murchison and the FIDCO board, and Wackenhut with Michael Riconosciuto. So now, there's your link. Michael McManus, advisor to President Ronald Reagan, George Pender, leading administrator of NSA's CSS, Central Security Services, Robert Mayhew, CIA, FBI Mafia, liaison with Ted Shackley, Clint Murchison Jr., William Pender, brother, CIA Station Chief in Saigon, Robert Booth Nichols, linked to the Nugan Bank, Wackenhut, arms sales to Australia, the loans affair that brought down the Whitlam government with Ted Shackley and Frank Gallucci, and Henry Kissinger. So there's now overwhelming evidence that the founders of the Cercle, the Six Eye, the Holy Alliance with the Pope, are the same people involved with the Iran-Contra sales and drugs. And Danny Casolaro had the smoking gun, which was the BCCI checks. He was hot on the trail. He had the copy of all the transactions of transfers from the Monte Carlo branch of BCCI, totaling $17 million. Dates and times. He had copies of the signatures of Khashoggi and Gorbanafar for the 1 million and 4 million BCCI checks paid through the Monte Carlo branch of BCCI. He had copies of the official letterheads, the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, for the transfer of the $1 million, the $4 million into the accounts, Khashoggi and also manager Gorbanafar, right through in 1985 through the Monte Carlo branch. Monte Carlo is becoming the centre for P2 Lodge, transactions involving Adnan Khashoggi, and also the P2 Lodge Monte Carlo. It's called the Monte Carlo Masonic Committee, the overseeing group that seems to be behind this holy alliance of linking money laundering, drugs and arms in the name of fighting communism. From the book A Spy for All Seasons by Dwayne Claridge, he clearly confirms the roles of Michael Ledeen being critical for bridging the links between Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig and manager Gorbanafar. Yes, he was charged over the Iran-Contra affair, but then pardoned by George H.W. Bush. But he describes Michael Ledeen as a fine journalist, scholar and a friend. He noted that CIA took a dim view of the individuals such as Michael Ledeen and retired CIA officer Theodore Shackley, who freelanced with foreign intelligence services, particularly Mossad and SAVAK, Iran intelligence, Egyptian intelligence, and also the fascist groups throughout South America, Chile, Bolivia, and also their links with the Golden Triangle for the drugs and links with the Gambino Mafia. In 1988, Ledeen and Shackley teamed up to provide war games type training for European intelligence services, including Italy's intelligence service. And so here we are. In 1980, they're at the centre of the Cercle, 6I, and also involved in the war games training programs with Italian intelligence services. Claridge explains Ledeen's damage to Jimmy Carter's presidential campaign by trumpeting up the Billy-Gaddafi relations earned the appreciation of Alexander Haig and other prominent Republicans. Claridge wrote that Ledeen further aggravated the CIA by becoming an unofficial conduit between Haig and General Giuseppe Santovito, head of Italian military service SISMI. This is important, that the role of Haig, Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen with the P2 Lodge. Claridge notes that in 1987 he was retired from the agency after being formally reprimanded. It was his friend Michael Ledeen, who used connections with a prominent General Dynamics shareholder to introduce Claridge to General Dynamics executives who offered him position at a company. Isn't it amazing that Michael Ledeen is central to everything between Italian intelligence, Israeli intelligence, and the whole Iran-Contra scandal, and the P2 Lodge scandal and the links to neo-fascist and neo-Nazi terrorist groups in Italy. What's important is that Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley and the Iran-Contra affair. According to the report of Congressional Committees investigating the Iran-Contra affair issued in November 1987, the sale of US arms to Iran through Israel began in summer of 1985 after receiving the approval of President Reagan. The report shows that Israel's involvement was stimulated by separate overtures in 1985, the time of these BCCI checks that Danny CASOLARO has with BCCI, Iranian arms merchant Manager Gorbanifar, and National Security Council consultant Michael Ledeen, the later working for National Security Advisor Robert McFarlane. When Ledeen asked Prime Minister Shimon Peres for assistance, the Israeli leader agreed to sell weapons to Iran at America's behest, providing the sale had high-level US approval. If there was a Mossad mole in the American administration, it has to be Michael Ledeen. According to the committee's report, NSC aide Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North first used money from the Iran operation to fund the Nicaraguan resistance in November 1985. He later testified, however, that the diversion of funds to the Contras was proposed to him by Gorbanifar during a meeting in January 1986. Saudi billionaire oil and arms trader Adnan Khashoggi said in an interview on ABC TV on December the 11th, 1986, that he advanced $1 million to help finance the first arms shipments in the Iran-Contra arms scandal and put up $4 million for the second shipment. Hence the 1 million check, the 4 million check that Danny CASOLARO was the smoking gun, all financed by the Kuwait royal family through Robert Sensi, William Casey, Robert Gray. In my research, I have confirmed categoric proof that the PROMIS software was being installed by the secret team on the aerostat radar tracking systems and AWACS and drones from Westinghouse and Hughes Aircraft through Alan Bond's company, Airships Industries Inc., and hence the $4 million check transfer from Dr. Earl Bryan and Hadron, delivered by Richard Babian, working for Richard Secord and Albert Hakem at Stanford Technology, was transferred to Australia and given to a Mossad agent, Joseph Goldberg, to give to Alan Bond. It was cleared through Allied Irish banks and through Pergamon Press International through Moscow accounts for Robert Maxwell. During my interviews with Michael Riconosciuto in 2004, he categorically confirmed in writing in letters to me, which I have, the first application, and he confirmed in his testimony in US courts 1990 and 1991 that the first application was for NATO and US Navy for the modified PROMIS software for tracking Soviet nuclear submarines, and that it was integrated into the missile fire control and command systems of the US Trident submarines using the VAX 11-7E80 computers. He's also elaborated further, it was the VAX 6000 series as well, which was required for it to be outfitted on the Trident submarines. Previous podcasts confirmed that Hadron Inc. had the contracts for the US Trident submarine missile fire control and command systems with Johns Hopkins University, the Applied Physics Division, which happened to be a partner with my company with the security technologies for healthcare throughout 1995 through to 1999 before being destroyed by a bogus prince, Prince Aldic, who came to Australia promising a $1 billion donation to the United Nations Trade Development Centre SEAL program, Secure Electronic Authentication Link, with my companies in partnership with the Australian Federal Government. He also confirms in his testimony in court and in letters to me that the second application was the modified PROMIS software was installed for the Swift banking. It was installed at Transaction Technologies Inc., a subsidiary of Citibank, and Dr. Earl Bryan, chairman of Hadron Inc. and CIA, to move the covert funds through the international automatic clearing houses. We also have the testimony of General Earl Cockey, who represented the World Bank and also represented Nugan Bank in Washington, testified 10 days before he died in 2000 that CIA was using Project Hammer at Citibank to clear Marcos's gold, the Nugan Bank's funds, and the Banca Ambrosiano funds. Gold bullion security notes for the transfer and money laundering of arms and drugs internationally. In my previous podcast, I revealed my research had confirmed that Chuck Missler was the director of Hadron Inc. with Earl Bryan. He also was appointed by William Simon to become the chairman and CEO of Hellenetics Inc., which was the SDI Star Wars program, with Bernard Kratz, who was the common investor, with Exonics with Earl Bryan, which developed the sonar tracking and detection systems for submarines, and also he was financing Helanetics Inc. with Edward Teller, famous scientist, inventor of the hydrogen bomb, and it was financed by Robert Gray. And Robert Gray is again the common link with Robert Sensi, Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, Michael Ledeen in EastCo, and represented BCCI and the Kuwait royal family and the Nicaraguan resistance. William Simon was also appointed to the board of Citibank with President Gerald Ford, and also John Deutsch, former director of CIA, and C. Michael Armstrong, the chairman of Johns Hopkins trustees, who was one of the groups that I was in litigation with A.B. Krongard, who became executive director of CIA, and Frank Bosnell, who owned Business Risk International, who employed Joseph Queller, who flew back urgently from Kuwait to meet with Danny Casolaro and set up his fatal meetings in Martinsburg, where he was found dead, with both wrists severely slashed. These coincidences are too much, given that President Ford mysteriously appears and offers to negotiate a $100 million settlement for my companies being defrauded by Johns Hopkins, and the architects of NSA's Echelon, who were the same group managing the Trident submarine command control systems with Hadron. Why Chuck Missler is important is that he was responsible for developing the systems for the AWACS with the NSA Echelon spy satellites and the NATO's nuclear missile defense system for tracking Soviet submarines. The common directors of Exonics was Edward Teller, Bernard Katz, and Earl Bryan, Dominic Leahy, that developed the X-ray technology and also sonar towing submarine tracking systems for the US Navy. Hadron Inc. had common directors again, Earl Bryan, Dominic Leahy, Charles Missler, for developing the command control systems for the AWACS and also for the Royal Saudi Air Defence and NATO systems and the Trident submarines. The most important thing is that the financier behind Helanetics was Robert Gray. Robert Gray was an investor in also Iris Swift banking software, the CIA DIA safe software, the fusion of all intelligent databases across all intelligence agencies with Hadron Inc., Simcom Inc., and the programmers all came from Ed Wilson and Ted Shackley's company, Operational Systems Inc. More importantly, the Iris Swift banking software was also developed with Computer Power Group, owned by Rupert Murdoch, who were the Australian distributors of Insular's PROMIS software, and their expertise was in artificial intelligence and the development of COBOL compilers. Robert Gray was also a director of EastCo, Consultants International, and is the key link with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Richard Secord, Eric von Marboard, and Michael Ledeen. Don't you just love the way that Michael Ledeen keeps turning up with Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig, Ed Wilson? Robert Gray and William Casey employed CIA agent Robert Sensi, and he was working for the Kuwait royal family to organise the Iran-Contra BCCI checks paid to Adnan Khashoggi, manager for Gordon, and these were held by Danny Casolaro. Robert Gray was also the CEO of Knowlton and Hill and represented Kuwait Royal Family, BCCI and the Nicaraguan resistance. This is key. In 1991, Ed Rogers served in the White House as Deputy Assistant to President George H.W. Bush and Executive Assistant to the Chief of Staff. Sam Bamier introduces Ed Rogers to Adnan Khashoggi and Kamal Adam to represent BCCI. Ed Rogers leaves White House and signs a $600,000 contract to represent Sheikh Kamal Adam, former head of Saudi intelligence, who was indicted with Faisal Saud al-Falaj and Robert Altman for the inquiry into the evidence of fraud and CIA involvement in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI, to money launder Iran-Contra arms and drugs with Manuel Noriega. Shortly after he left White House, Rogers was in frequent contact with Bamier, placing calls to him on August 5th, 13th, 14th, 15th, 16th, 26th and 28th of August, and attending a party at the house of San Mateo, California on August 27 with Bamier, hosted by Adnan Khashoggi. Rogers' meeting with Khashoggi at the party hosted by Bamier is of particular interest to the subcommittee of BCCI investigation because Khashoggi's ties in the Middle East, including reported business dealing with Adam and the role in BCCI. Khashoggi had accounts with BCCI in France and used those accounts to move millions of dollars for financing his US arms sales to Iran. In November 1981, Prince Fahd, who had later become king, told Bamier that he was pleased Congress had agreed to sell AWACS surveillance planes to the kingdom in exchange for AWACS. King Fahd said he will help you guys fight anti-communism movements, according to Bamier. In 1983, Prince Bandar asked Bamier if he would go into business with Richard Secord and Albert Hakem to bid in a security project at Saudi airport. Secord and Hakem were key figures in the plan to channel money from the sale of US weapons to Iran to the Contra rebels fighting Nicaragua's leftist government. The business relationship was never cemented because the three never got the contract. In 1983, Saudi officials asked Bamier to funnel money to Morocco for training UNITA guerrillas. The Saudis said former CIA Director William Casey was aware of the plan, Bamier said. In February 1984, Bandar approached Bamier in Cannes, France, asking him to set up an offshore company that would supply goods and services to anti-communist movements and oil to South Africa. And this is the overlap with Ted Shackley. Bandar said he declined, even though Bandar said, don't worry about the legalities, because Casey was discussing the matter with King Fahd. And here is the press release Saudis reportedly used to bankroll US policies for the AWAC, and the key parts of this. Alexander Haig's AWAC sale to Saudi Arabia. In a speech to Congress, Alexander Haig said that if the AWAC sale was blocked, our security, the security of Israel and the peace itself might be endangered. Isn't he loyal to Israel with Michael Ledeen and Ted Shackley? Reagan himself promoted the AWAC sale, saying, by contributing to the stability of the area, it improves Israel's security. The administration even commissioned former government officials to speak about AWACS as part of the peace cause. Richard Nixon's Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, said it's essential for the peace process in the Middle East. Sam Bamier confirms that Adnan Khashoggi was involved in the sale of the AWACS to Saudi Arabia in return for their financial support for CIA armed deals with Angola, UNITA, Iran-Contra and the Afghan Mujahideen. This is clearly independent evidence showing the importance of the role of Alexander Haig with Khashoggi, with Ted Shackley, Gorbanafar, Michael Ledeen, who is the common personal advisor to Alexander Haig and Ted Shackley. And there's the press release, Saudi Millions Fund, Wide Range US Policies, Businessman Says. And so, without a doubt, we have the links of Robert Sensi, William Wilson, Ambassador to the Vatican, Alexander Haig, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, tied up in AWAC sales to Israel, the fight against communism with the Cercle, 6i, the links to P2 Lodge, Banca Ambrosiana, Nugenhan Bank, BCCI for the money laundering of drugs and arms. The BCCI investigation report particularly targeted Ed Rogers and Sandra Charles and Frank Colucci. In his disposition with the subcommittee, Rogers indicated that he only contacted Sam Bamia, a businessman with Sandra Charles, a mid-level former NSC and Defence Department staffer. The other person with whom Rogers claims to have discussed Kamal Adam was Sandra Charles, a former staffer, National Security Council, who left the White House at approximately the same time Rogers did in order to work for, wait for it, International Planning and Analysis Centre, known as IPAC, a consulting firm headed by Frank Colucci, former Deputy Director, CIA Secretary Defense. And my former podcast showed that Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger allowed Frank Colucci to set up the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy the Gough Whitlam government in 1975 with Nugenhan Bank Director Michael Hand and MI6 agents Sir Harry Gillen and Eric Sear Cowles. Charles told Rogers that she didn't know much about Kamal Adam, but that she would try to gather information and report back to him. According to Charles, she then called Saudi diplomatic source at the embassy who confirmed that Adam was a former head of Saudi intelligence and that he was related by marriage to the former king and that he was a wealthy businessman. According to Rogers, he later asked Charles to set up a meeting for him with Frank Colucci to discuss whether or not Mr. Colucci's firm could act as a financial advisor to Sheikh Adam. The meeting took place on October 7th, 1991. This is a few months after Danny Casolaro is found dead with both wrists slashed. According to Rogers, Colucci told him, "We don't manage finances, we don't manage people's money, we do things on a deal-by-deal basis." Sandra Charles, after leaving the government in 1990, she served as Vice President for International Government Affairs of International Planning Analysis Centre, working directly for Frank Colucci. Miss Charles spent 16 years at the National Security Foreign Policy Committee of the Executive Branch of the US government, as a member of the National Security Council staff and of the White House and in the Office of Secretary of Defense International Securities Affair, ISA, which just keeps coming up. She was personally involved in USG negotiations and policy development on security cooperation, including Bush administration policy for Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. Prior to this assignment, Miss Charles served as the acting Deputy Assistant Secretary and Director of Near East South Asia region in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs from June 1985 to August 1988. During that period, she was a key player in forging the Reagan administration policies towards the Iran-Iraq war, including the US military operations to protect Kuwait shipping in the Gulf in 1987 to 1988. It looks like all roads are leading to Kuwait royal family. In my investigations over 20 years and interviews with James Rothstein for well over 20 years now, he arrested CIA assassin Frank Sturgis during the Watergate scandal. He was then appointed and he investigated the US customs evidence involving Peter Wiedniks and Michael Riconosciuto. He investigated CIA Operation Human Compromise involving Roy Cohen and Ed P. Wilson to compromise government officials and government employees and politicians. He received a telephone call from Pope Paul I 2 weeks before his mysterious death, requesting Rothstein to investigate evidence of pedophiles in the Catholic Church and money laundering through the Vatican Bank. In my interviews with James Rothstein, he says categorically, I was hired as an undercover investigator by Alexander Magnus, who was a US presidential candidate, to investigate evidence that his foundation was being used by Oliver North and Tom Posse. I was hired as an undercover investigator by US Customs to investigate evidence that Peter Wiedniks had purged himself during Michael Riconosciuto's court trial, denying that he knew Michael Riconosciuto and denying that he knew Dr. Earl Bryan and his company Hadron Inc. During our investigations of Peter Wiedniks, we were shocked when Alexander Haig suddenly and mysteriously intervened and shut down the US Customs investigation into Peter Wiedniks. That is critical evidence and confirms why my PROMIS investigations and problems in Australia were leading to Alexander Haig, given the evidence that I was uncovering with his links with the mafia, with banker Ambrosiana, and the AWACS sales using the PROMIS software. This message was conveyed to me by Robert Booth Nichols himself when appearing in Australia in December 2004, making threats against my life. So we have confirmation. This is the quote when I met Robert Booth Nichols. I didn't know it was Robert Booth Nichols at the time. He had contacted the TV station SBS, who had televised my fraud case and federal police investigation into the board of directors and trustees of Johns Hopkins who committed fraud against my company. And he states, your research is upsetting very powerful Israeli businessmen, and you do not know who you are dealing with until you receive a crowbar to the back of your head. If you continue with your investigations, then you will have the military coming down on you. All your problems in Australia lead directly to Alexander Haig. So the relationship between Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, Alexander Haig, Peter Wiedniks, and Robert Booth Nichols lead to Wackenhut, the PROMIS software, with Michael Riconosciuto, and Robert Booth Nichols' role with Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, to set up the loans affair with the Nugan Bank in Australia in 1975 to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns, the Federal Treasurer of Australia, and Gough Whitlam, the Prime Minister of Australia, given their opposition to Echelon, Pine Gap's facilities, spying on the Australian government, and possible banning of nuclear ships and submarines from the US using the ports of Australia. And also my evidence that's overwhelming that Robert Booth Nichols, together with the Gambino Mafia, Ted Shackley's team, and also with Dr. John Phillips Nichols, with the Gambino Mafia and the Cabazon casinos were laundering the drugs through Nuganhan Bank with CIA from Thailand and also from Lebanon and South America. When I interviewed the last girlfriend, Wendy Golden, I tracked her down by getting in contact with James Ridgway and Doug Vaughn. Eventually I found her telephone number and address and was able to call her, and she took me into her confidence and I was able to interview her. And I recorded my interviews with her for many hours, and she confirmed that during the week of Danny Casolaro dying, she was invited to stay at the Watergate Hotel for a week with the Crown Prince and cousin of the Emir of Kuwait. By communicating with her, I didn't give any details, but I had a suspicion of who it was based on my research on who was in the US during that time. So I sent just the picture of this Kuwait royal family member. I didn't give the name or details, just the photograph. And as soon as I sent it to her, she confirmed categorically that definitely is the person that I was staying with. She was paid $10,000 to stay for 1 week at the Watergate Hotel with this Crown Prince. And it turns out the Crown Prince is Saad Abdullah Al Sabah. He's the actual Prime Minister of Kuwait. So the chances of Danny's new girlfriend, who was a waitress at a restaurant in Herndon, the details of her name, contact details was given to the Martinsburg police, and they never telephoned or interviewed her. Neither did the US Department of Justice with the Zipperstein team. No one ever contacted her, and this is what she confirms, that she was paid $10,000 to stay for a whole week at the Watergate Hotel with the Crown Prince, and she names all of the restaurants that they went to, the places they visited. She described the bedroom, the balcony, even the security guards that were guarding him. Not only that, she describes in detail Danny Casolaro's bedroom. The bed was surrounded by folders of his research. She couldn't walk through them. She said she had to do a run and a leap and a jump over all the folders just to get onto the bed. She also describes in detail the book that Danny had written, the novel, and the new book that he was writing, which was called The Octopus. She then confirms that later in that year, the Crown Prince was back in Florida to attend the annual boat racing event in Florida, and was invited and flown down to stay on his yacht for another week. So the records are going to be quite clear that why would the Crown Prince, the Prime Minister of Kuwait, the royal family member, want to distract Danny's Casolaro's new girlfriend not to be with him during the week when he visits Martinsburg to meet with an Arab man who is going to provide all of the evidence to him, and that meeting was set up by CIA agent Special Forces Major Joseph Guala, who had flown back urgently from Kuwait after Desert Storm to assist Danny Casolaro with his investigations into the PROMIS software and BCCI, and set a meeting up with Peter Wiednieks, and Robert Altman. Also, why would Robert Booth Nichols fly urgently back from Kuwait, contracted to assist the Kuwait royal family to recover the stolen gold bullion and art treasures by the Saddam Hussein's forces, fly back to spend a whole month with Danny CASOLARO? All roads led to Kuwait. And so this is the Prince with President Reagan, the Prime Minister of Kuwait, with James Baker, Secretary of Treasury, and a special event thanking former President George Bush for his support during Desert Storm to save Kuwait. The chances of a very poor girlfriend working as a poor waitress in a restaurant in Herndon, who's now dating Danny CASOLARO, to be selected by the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Kuwait to spend a week with him while Danny CASOLARO is meeting with key witnesses that can verify the BCCI checks financed by the Kuwait royal family for the Iran-Contra scandal involving Ted Shackley, Robert Sensi, William Kaysen, Robert Gray, who represents the Kuwait royal family, and Robert Altman, BCCI, Ted Shackley, and the Nicaraguan resistance is beyond belief. And so Danny CASOLARO surrounded by Major Joseph Queller and Robert Booth Nichols, the same man that came to Australia to threaten me. He had the smoking gun. So Robert Sensi worked for the Kuwait royal family. He worked for William Wilson, the President Reagan's ambassador to the Vatican. William Casey, Director of CIA. Robert Gray, representing Kuwait royal family, owns Eastco Consultants International with Ted Shackley, Ed Wilson, Richard Secord, and Michael Ledeen. Clint Murchison. He finances and arranges the checks financed by the Kuwait royal family, and he's working at the Watergate Hotel for the chairman of Kuwait Airlines, a member of the Kuwait royal family, and the ambassador to Kuwait, located also at Watergate Hotel. And Ted Shackley's company, TGS International, contracted to the Kuwait royal family and government, building a warehouse with the Navy forces and storage areas. So let's go back to the testimony of Robert Sensi. He confirms what might become a second Iran-Contra in late 1985. His partnership and company with Habib Mollem in Iran contact Robert Sensi's proposed that Iran would trade oil and the American hostages in return for US help in reconstructing its oil refineries, which have been bombed by the Iraqis. So this is 1988. He says the proposal was the brainchild of William Wilson, the US ambassador to the Vatican. So this is no doubt that William Wilson is playing a key role with Robert Sensi for the Iran-Contra and the negotiation of oil contracts in exchange for the hostages. And he arranged to meet Robert Sensi and Habib Mollem to meet Vice President Bush, William Casey, and a number of people from Robert Gray's lobbying firm. So the key instigator is William Wilson, the US ambassador to the Vatican. The meeting got leaked to the press and never took place, but plans were drawn up by William Casey, Robert Sensi, and Robert Carter. Danny had in his possession, in addition to the BCCI checks, he had met at a hotel with the author, Robert Bickle, who had all the intelligence relating to Robert Sensi, relationship with Ambassador William Wilson, Richard Secord, Oliver North, William Buckley, and Jen Jensen over an Iran in oil and arms deal known as LCF, dealt with Libya. He says that it was involving the Philofally Foundation, dealt with the LCF financing, particularly the insurance money relating to this oil deal. Robert Sensi owned Cyrus International, or Cyrus International, and the people associated are Robert Mario Sensi, Habib Moellen, and also James Kilgore, Tony Green of Short's Company, and a British MI6 agent known as Ian Smalley. Smalley's contacts in Iran is Colonel Mafakari, who may have been Major Yawa Yet Yana, talked of high-ranking loyalist officers in Iran. Both were Air Force officers. So we now have that Daniel CASOLARO has key evidence, the smoking gun. The BCCI checks involving Ted Shackley, Michael Agene, Adna Khashoggi, Manager Gorbanafar, William Casey, and also Robert Gray and Clint Murchison relationships, but it's all been organised by William Wilson, the ambassador to the Vatican. In addition to that, he was holding the report. I got these from Danny's personal research files. He was clearly on the trail of the checks involving Robert Sensi. It details that Orc International, owned by Sarkis Sogonalian, the arms dealer. Now, if you recall that Richard Babian had testified in his affidavit to Bill Hamilton at Inslaw that he witnessed and knew that Richard Secord and Earl Bryan were selling the PROMIS software in attendance with Sarkis Sogonalian in Iraq, and also involves Felix Rodriguez and Max Romastrated as bodyguard to, and I don't know what M.S.S is, but it was a CIA that has been acknowledged by Vice President Bush. M.S.S was arrested in Switzerland in 1981 but somehow beat the charges. M.S.S flew Admiral Dan Murphy, and this is important because he joins Robert Gray's company, but he was the Chief of Staff to Vice President Bush to meet with Noriega in Panama. Frequently, Admiral Daniel J. Murphy's office number in Washington was 202-456-6606. He was Chief of Staff for the Vice President Bush. The British case report shows letters of commission to M.S.S from Smalley in January 1982. The company that M.S.S was involved with in the Swiss arrest was a Jersey Island company called Boca, B-O-C-A. So this is damning new evidence that I'm putting together for you to show the convincing evidence of the Holy Alliance in the name of the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, P2 Lodge, to fight communism, are the key people behind the Iran-Contra arms and drugs. He also had in this report Tradeco, Swiss, owned by CIA agent James Fees. James Fees is known to Robert Sensi. James Fees knows Smalley, the MI5 agent. James Fees connected to William Northrop. Now, I'm also holding another report I'll do as a podcast, which is the $2 billion brokers of death deal that involved Oliver Noriega's drugs, CIA front companies and Mossad companies French companies in Singapore that were busted by customs and exposed involving William Northrop and the CIA agent who flew to Israel in 1982 and met directly with Rafi Eitan. This is unbelievable evidence, but shows that it relates to Richard C. Cord flying to Israel, called Operation Tip Kettle, with William Casey to negotiate the purchase of the Russian arms captured in the war on Lebanon to be sold to Nicaragua in exchange for Israel being permitted to buy a top secret military company, which I will confirm was involving Solomon Schwartz, Earl Bryan, Richard C. Cord, and has links with the Gambino Mafia and heroin shipments from Kuwait during Desert Storm to New York with the Gambino Mafia. And so it says here that UK, a book about fees is Fanning the Flames by Kenneth R. Timmerman. Fees dealt with Swede Swesson, who is possibly Jens Jensen, Bernard Saliot, Claude Lang, who operated Panama Co. called Daola Finance. Both men are supposed to be French. An article appeared about in San Francisco Chronicle, February 2nd, 1987. I have all of the articles relating. It's called The Brokers of Death. $2 billion brokers of death involving Israel military, CIA agents, French intelligence, front companies in Singapore, but involves Nicaragua and drugs from Manuel Noriega and whose contacts are with Oliver North. So let's go further. Danny was holding further evidence relating to Robert Sensi. It says Michael Spawn's address, 111 3rd Avenue, New York. William Northrop, ex-Special Forces, CIA with Casey. Israeli movement of Jews from Iran, arrested in sting in Bermuda. Criminal case number is Michael Spawn phone number. Prosecutor Lorna Schofield, code name Sasha, involved with Calvin White, aka James Kilgore, of US Embassy in London, friend of Habib Moallen. Tony Green of MI6 London with company called Shorts Co. Worked with James Fees, has knowledge of dope, drugs, Israel, Contras and weapons to and from USA. Robert Mario Sensi, CIA, it confirms in this report to Danny, given to him by Richard Bickle, is confirming that he was arrested on fraud case of stolen securities. His attorney is Stephen Allen Salzberg, Professor, University of Virginia. This attorney works as counsel to Special Prosecutor Walsh of the Iran-Contra affair. Isn't that incredible that these things don't come out in the official reports of the links to Ted Shackley, William Wilson, Robert Gray, but eventually come out in BCCI investigation with Jack Blum. It's just incredible. It goes on to show that Robert Sensi ran with an Iranian, Habib Moalem, was Cyrus International's contact of aka James Kilgore. Sensi has knowledge of William Wilson, the Vatican ambassador, Jens Jensen, the 640 account with Kuwait royal family, Khalid Jaffa, and also Alaman Impex Company they owned, that was moved from Washington to London. Sensi worked directly with William Casey and says that he signed secrecy agreements with CIA. He states that he has no pressure from the Israeli government, but that many others that he knows of certainly do. Employed by Kuwait Airlines as sales manager and set up the accounts for Casey worldwide. He has knowledge of LCF, which was Jess Jensen, the Uncle Mo connection. And then we go on further in what Danny Casolaro was holding with the BCCI checks. The continuation of Northrop, known as Sasha, involved with narcotic shipments into the USA, the proceeds of which were used by the Israelis to furnish arms to assets of the USA that the USA could not be seen to be supplying, was arrested with General Barr, AM, attorney for Lonhro. Isn't that interesting? Lonhro again with Roland, and associated with Colonels Wayne Long and Jerry King. Also had dope connection with CIA Station Chief Fernandez in Costa Rica. And that's where Major Joseph Queller had been living, in Costa Rica. So we now have overwhelming evidence that the same people who are involved in the Holy Alliance with the Vatican to fight communism, integrated with the Knights of Malta, the Opus Dei, the P2 Lodge, and the Cercle and 6i, linked to neo-Nazi, neo-fascist organisations, have founded Trilateral Commission set up by Henry Kissinger and David Rockefeller, are actually involved as Knights of Malta to establish all of the money laundering operation for the drugs and arms through Banca Ambrosiana, Nugenham Bank, BCCI, Citibank, for the sale and distribution of drugs worldwide and arms to keep fascist, Nazi-linked leaders in government in the name of national security to fight communism. And finally, most accounts, Casey stepped into a vacuum. So let's go back to the Holy Alliance. Casey stepped into the vacuum in the first days as declaration of martial law in Poland, and he did as he did in Central America. He became the principal policy architect. Meanwhile, Pipes, the NSE staff, began drafting proposals for sanctions. The object was to drain the Soviets and to lay blame for martial law at their doorstep, says Pipes. The sanctions were coordinated with Special Operations, the CIA division in charge of covert task forces, and the first objective was to keep Solidarity alive by supplying money, communications and equipment. The church was trying to modulate the whole situation, explains one of the NSC officials who directed the effort to curtail the pipeline. They, church leaders, were in effect trying to create circumstances that would head off the serious threat of Soviet intervention, while allowing us to get tougher and tougher. They were part and parcel of virtually all of our deliberations in terms of how we viewed the evolution of government-sponsored repression in Poland, whether it was loosening or getting worse, and how we should proceed. So Poland is the key for Ted Shackley and the neocons to move in and exploit this holy alliance with the Vatican, hijack the Vatican Bank with Ambrosiana, launder drugs and arms, gold, US securities and currencies internationally in the name of God. The Pope himself, not only his deputies, met with American officials to assess events in Poland and the effectiveness of American actions, and sent back messages, sometimes by letter, sometimes orally, to Reagan. On almost all of his trips to Europe and the Middle East, Casey flew first to Rome so that he could meet with John Paul II and exchange information. But the principal emissary between Washington and Rome remained Vernon Walters, a former deputy director of CIA who worked easily with Casey. Walters met with the Pope perhaps a dozen times according to Vatican sources. Walters was sent to and from the Vatican for specific purpose of carrying messages between the Pope and the President, says former US Ambassador to the Vatican, William Wilson. It wasn't supposed to be known that Walters was there. It wasn't all specifically geared to Poland. Sometimes there were also discussions about Central America or the hostages in Lebanon. So we have the key people, the Knights of Malta, William Casey, Vernon Walters and William Wilson are now the emissaries to the Pope. Often the Reagan years, American covert operations, including Afghanistan, Nicaragua and Angola, involved lethal assistance to insurgent forces, arms, mercenaries, military advisors and explosives. In Poland, the Pope and the President and Casey embarked on the opposite path. What they had to do was let the natural forces already in place play this out and not get their fingerprints on it, explains an analyst. What emerges from the Reagan-Casey collaboration is a carefully calibrated operation whose scope was modest compared with other CIA activities. If Casey were around now, he'd be having some smiles, observes one of his reluctant admirers. In 1991, Reagan and Casey got the reordering of the world that they wanted. And then NSD secret directive. Less than 3 weeks before his meeting with the Pope in 1982, President Reagan signed a secret National Security Decision Directive, NSDD 32, that authorized a range of economic, diplomatic and covert measures to neutralize efforts of the USSR to maintain its hold on Europe, Eastern Europe. And hence previous podcast talks about William Casey's role with economic warfare and the economy to control the banks, destabilize the USSR's economy and banks and the ruble with Leon Wanta, and also Richard Pearl leading the COCOM agreement to prevent the sale of Western technologies, advanced technologies to the Soviet Union. Hence the applications of PROMIS for banking and also the COCOM agreement for tracking technologies with NATO. In terms of the most important covert operations undertaken were those inside Poland. The primary purpose of NSDD 32 were to destabilise the Polish government through covert operations involving propaganda and the organisational aid to solidarity, the promotion of human rights, particularly those related to the rights of worship in the Catholic Church, economic pressure and diplomatic isolation of the communist regime. The document, citing the need to defend democratic reform efforts throughout the Soviet Empire, also called for increasing propaganda and underground broadcasting operations in Eastern Europe, actions that Reagan's aides and dissidents in Eastern Europe believed were particularly helpful in chipping away at the notion of Soviet invincibility. And hence, this is the purpose of the Cercle and 6I. As Republican Congressman Henry Hyde, a member of the Housing Intelligence Committee from 1985 to 1990, who was apprised of some of the administration's covert actions, observes, "In Poland, we did all the things that are done in countries where you want to destabilize communist government and strengthen resistance to that. We provided the supplies and technical assistance in terms of clandestine newspapers, broadcasting, propaganda, money, organisational help and advice, and working outward from Poland, the same kind of resistance was organised in other communist countries of Europe." I think you'll find that the Cercle and the 6I was authorised to do that internally within America, Australia, the UK, Canada, and throughout Europe, to ensure that they control democratic processes and the opinion to get the governments and leaders appointed that they wanted to control and could control. Among those who played a consulting role was Zbigniew Brzezinski, a native of Poland. So here we have the common thread. Brzezinski and Shackley are natives of Poland. And President Jimmy Carter's National Security Advisor, he says, "I got along very well with Casey," recalls Brzezinski. "He was very flexible and very imaginative and not very bureaucratic. If something needed to be done, it was done. To sustain an underground effort takes a lot in terms of supplies, networks, and this is why solidarity wasn't crushed. On military questions, American intelligence was better than the Vatican's, but the Church excelled in its evaluations of the political situation. And in understanding the mood of the people and communicating with the solidarity leaders, the Church was an incomparable position. Our information about Poland was very well founded because the bishops were in continual contact with the Holy See and the Solidarnoscs," explains Cardinal Silvestrini, the Vatican's Deputy Secretary of State at the time. "They informed us about prisoners, about the activities and needs of solidarity groups, and about the attitude and schisms in the government. All this information was communicated to the President or Casey." Gideon Spies, written by Gordon Thomas in his interviews with Mossad. He states that Naim Admoni began to explore CIA's current involvement with the papacy. In between Casey's regular visits to the Pope, an important player in the relationship between the Vatican and the CIA was Cardinal John Kroll of Philadelphia, who shuttled between the White House and the Apostolic Palace. To Monsignor John McGee, the People's English Language Secretary, Kroll was the Holy Father's extra special pal. Both came from a similar background, knew the same Polish songs and stories, and could joke across the Pope's dining table in a local Polish dialect. The rest of us just sat there and smiled, not understanding a word. It had been Kroll who had accompanied Casey to the CIA director's first audience with John Paul after his convalescence. Later, the Cardinal had introduced Casey's deputy, Vernon Walters, to the pontiff. Since then, the list of subjects the CIA officer and the Pope discussed ranged from terrorism in the Middle East to the internal politics of the Church and the health of the Kremlin leaders. For Richard Allen, also a Catholic, who was Ronald Reagan's first national security advisor, the relationship between the CIA and the Pope was one of the great alliances of all time. Reagan had this deep conviction the Pope would help him to change the world. He goes on to say that Cobongo had first encountered the Washington spy master on November 30th, 1981, shortly after John Paul returned to work after being shot. After Cobongo joined John Paul for the first prayers of his day, on the long case clock in the corridor outside the private chapel in the papal apartments, the two men had gone to the panelled study to receive CIA Deputy Director Vernon Walters. Bongo would recall, I took up the usual position in the corner of the room, a notebook on my knee. There was no interpreter present. General Walters asked what language would he use. His Holiness said he would be comfortable with Italian. Walters began saying he brought the greetings from President Reagan. The Pope returned to the facilitations, then it was down to business. Walters produced satellite photographs and His Holiness was fascinated to see how clear they were. Walters spoke for over an hour about CIA's view of the latest Soviet intentions. His Holiness thanked him. At the end of the meeting, Walters produced a number of rosaries and asked the Pope to bless them, explaining they were for relations and friends, and His Holiness did so. More certain common goals were established. The President and the Pontiff had proclaimed their united position to abortion. The United States blocked millions of dollars of aid to countries that ran family planning programs. The Pope, through a purposeful silence, supported US military policies, including supplying NATO with new generation cruise missiles. The CIA regularly bugged the phones of bishops and priests in Central America. Don't you just love that? It was well known in my discussions with Jimmy Rothstein that the CIA was bugging the confessional boxes in order to get the dirt on political leaders and leaders of industry internationally, and that was used as for the Operation Compromise. So it says the CIA regularly bugged the phones of bishops and priests in Central America who advocated liberation theology and opposed US-based forces in Nicaragua and El Salvador. The phone transcripts form part of the Pope's Friday briefing by the Rome CIA station chief. Reagan had also personally authorized Colonel Oliver North, then working for the National Security Council, to make regular and substantial payments to priests the Vatican deemed loyal in Central and South America, Africa and Asia. The money was used to support their often lavish lifestyles and promote the Holy See's opposition to birth control and divorce. Isn't that an amazing insight? Intrigued by the Pope's ability to switch from temporal to spiritual matters, Adamoni used his personal friendship, wait for it, with Secretary of State Alexander Haig. They had met when Adamoni worked out of Israeli embassy in Washington to obtain a copy of CIA's psychological profile of John Paul, Pope John Paul. Isn't that interesting? So Alexander Haig gives the Israeli Mossad a copy of CIA's psychological profile of John Paul. It was a portrait of a man whose religious fervour could be so intense that he would cry out when praying and would often be found on the marble floor of his private chapel, face down, arms extended on form of cross, as still as in death. He could spend hours in the prone position, yet his anger could be eruptive and fearful to behold. Then he would storm and shout. His grasp of geopolitics was formidable, and he could be as unflinching as any dictator. John Paul was also not afraid to confront the Curia, the Vatican Civil Service, or his long-serving Secretary of State, Agostino Casaroli. The profile concluded that John Paul was highly politicized from his Polish experiences and that he relishes being a player on the world stage. For Naim Adamoni, One matter was clear: the close and self-serving ties between CIA and the Pope had played a crucial role in John Paul coming to accept the American view that the attempt on his life had been organised by the Kremlin. So now we have the fabric of a holy alliance for Vernon Walters in the 70s to fund and set up the Cercle, 6i, with Brian Crozier and Carlo Presenti, endorsed and supported by Henry Kissinger, billionaire David Rockefeller, linked to a secret Catholic organisation known as Sint Unum in the plan covered in the memorandum by Henry Kissinger for President Nixon. It all started back in the 70s during Kissinger, David Rockefeller and Vernon Walters. It was an alliance that would continue through the 70s and 80s to then include William Wilson, Alexander Haig, Michael Ledeen, Ted Shackley, and Sabrinsky, who then founded with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and Carlo Presenti the Trilateral Commission. Meanwhile, our secret team, in its alliance with Lucio Gelli, together with Archbishop Paul Masinkas, Robert Calvi, God's banker, and Mikhail Sindona, through the P2 Lodge and support of Crown Prince Otto Habsburg, with their alliances for the Cercle 6i, are now using the Vatican Bank and Banca Ambrosiana for the laundering of all the arms and the drugs internationally, with the Nugan Bank, with BCCI and Citibank. The Cercle 6i was then captured by the neocons in their takeover of American policy. 7. Kramer, Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, Douglas Faith, and Michael Ledeen are predominantly involved with the Cercle and 6i, with its links and with the support of Michael Ledeen advising Alexander Haig, and Michael Ledeen as an advisor to Ted Shackley, opens the doors for Ted Shackley and Lucia Gelli to travel to meetings at White House to entrench the P2, the Knights of Malta, Opus Dei, and their links with the Vatican Bank and Banco Ambrosiana for sanctioned laundering of drugs and arms worldwide in the name of God. It turns out that Brzezinski founded the Trilateral Commission with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller, and Carlo Presenti. And the links of the Trilateral Commission are astounding. What I'll do is I'm going to bring up a diagram that I have developed over 20 years. And I'll zoom in a bit for you, but here is the Trilateral Commission set up by Brzezinski, together with David Rockefeller, and Henry Kissinger, and Carlo Presenti, who is personal friends and linked with Lucia Jelly with the P2 Lodge. So the P2 Lodge and the Monte Carlo Masonic Committee, which involves all of these people here at a higher level, are involved in the establishment of what's called the Trilateral Commission. They also control the Cercle, the 6I, with the endorsements and funding now of CIA. And what I'll show you is that this trilateral also involved Jeffrey Epstein, who was supported by Lynn Foster Rothschild and Evelyn Rothschilds. And if you have a look, the links with Martin Rich, going through to Jacob Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch, James Woolsey from CIA, and Michael Steinhardt, seized control and own Genie Energy in Israel reserves, oil reserves. But it's all linked back to the Rothschild holdings. And as I said in my previous podcast, no one knows that L.F. Rothschild's was the financial backer of Inslaw Inc. for the development of their PROMIS software. Or N.M. Nathan Rothschild's, that sets the gold prices every Monday in London, was also the financier behind Computer Power Group with their development of the PROMIS software and Lean software, which is CIA's modified software for tracking SWIFT accounts and through the banking transactions worldwide. And so you have an empire of Rothschilds bankrolling all the things on Follow the Money with PROMIS for SWIFT banking, together linked across with a Masonic committee and also a secret Catholic organisation, which is a collection of Opus Dei and Knights of Malta. Given that also Henry Kissinger is known to be involved with the Illuminati, and so is Jacob Rothschild, which is overseeing the infiltration of all Masonic lodges worldwide. And so the Knights of Malta can issue their own diplomatic pouches and passports, which makes it easier for CIA and also the mafia to move money, gold and drugs into any country without being checked by customs. And I revealed all of that process with the Knights of Malta, with the Gambino Mafia, with the Nugenhan Bank in my podcast, showing how they were moving drugs and money through governments worldwide and countries worldwide with their own diplomatic passports. The most important thing that I'll zoom in here is, I'm going to show you in my future podcast now, continuing on, is that Mikhail Sindona had written directly to President Reagan from prison, pleading with him that he was going to subpoena Alexander Haig and Stanford Turner to support what he'd been sanctioned to do with the money and arms and drugs. And particularly he talks about the evidence of his links with John Gambino from Sicily, who is the world's largest trafficker of heroin through Turkey, Italy into New York. But I'm going to show you that the registrations of Banca Ambrosiana overseas in the Bahamas, the directors were Sindona, Calvi and Marcinkus, and their attorney is a 33-degree Mason, Ralph Seligman, who is a co-director of Commodore International Bahamas with Alexander Haig. And he also represented Robert Vesco and his interest in the Bahamas, and links direct back to the Gambino Mafia, and his links with Mitchell Verbal, who surprisingly, in the sale of weapons, and Robert Vesco and Mitchell were selling the MAC-10 and silencers that are used by assassins, but also used and sold to rebels and dictators worldwide, and mercenaries with CIA. And the interesting thing is that the founder of the Cercle, and also a member of the P2 Lodge, and founder of Trilateral Commission with Henry Kissinger, David Rockefeller and Zabinski, had funded and bankrolling not only the Cercle, but he was funding the National Vanguard neo-Nazi and neo-fascism terrorist group, headed by Dali Chiari, who was employed by Otto Scazzini as an assassin in Spain and South America. And you will find that he is the leader of the secret Catholic order that was endorsed by David Rockefeller, Henry Kissinger, for CIA to fund and establish the Cercle and 6I. And if we go further down, you'll find that Kissinger Associates and Frank Colucci with the Kyle Group are the key advisors to the Trilateral Commission. Frank Colucci is Sovereign Malta, Military Order of Malta, and Henry Kissinger, of course, and Brent Scowcroft is as well. So in my research over 20 years, I've made notes of the Knights of Malta and this special Catholic order that is seamless, that transcends all borders, unites the military across all nations, not only Israel, America, Australia, Canada, UK, Germany, France, Italy, but also Israel and the Soviet Union. This is a bond of loyalty that goes higher than to governments. So the question is, whose loyalties do they hold? And it's not United States. It's a higher order. It's a Masonic order. And so I will show you that Michael Ledeen is the key person, advisor, who turned up in Australia with Robert Booth Nichols on the same day when the threats were made against me, advising me that my problems lead to Alexander A, and I'm upsetting some very powerful Israeli businessmen. He's the key person attending an Israeli briefing session in Melbourne, Australia, on the same day, and he's the person that set up the Iran-Contra deal with the BCCI checks that were held by Danny Casolaro that I was exposing. And you will find that as Michael was briefing me on the truth of the role of Ted Shackley in Australia with Henry Kissinger and Robert Booth Nichols, he owned a company, Cercle, which was making guns and night goggles in a partnership with Richard Secord and Albert Haycom, who had their ventures with Adna Khashoggi and Manitou Gorbanafar. And of course, it goes across to Michael Hand and the Nugan Bank and Eastco with, you name it, Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley and Robert Gray. And so we have the same people turning up. On the Wackenhut side, we've got William Casey was serving as the counsel to Wackenhut at the time, leading up to when Michael's there, and Peter Wiedniks delivers the PROMIS software tapes to Wack and Hart, and for Hadron and Simcom. And so I won't go much further than that, just to let you know that if you follow the money and the history of PROMIS, my research has got the corporation and legal documents and memos of CIA confirming that Project Democracy, or the NED, National Endowment Foundation for Democracy, was funded by Rupert Murdoch at the request of Walter Roman and William Casey and Roy Cohen, who had set up the meeting for him to meet with President Reagan. And of course he was financed by Stanley Schumann, Allen and Co. to fund News Limited, but were also funding Earl Bryan to set up his two companies, Hadron and Simcom. And I won't go on further, but the corporation records show that it turns out that Operational Systems Inc. was owned by Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley and Joseph Capucci. And they're all linked with Robert Gray, Frank Turple, and hence Task Force 157 in its links to the loans affair in Australia. But I can prove in a future podcast, I will show you the links of Task Force, Ted Shackley, Lucy and Conine, DSOG, Mitchell Werbel, and Roy Frankhauser, with the Ku Klux Klan and Nazi Party setting up all the BCCI accounts for Noriega, Michael Hari, and Paul Leah Alexander, the Mossad agent. And they sold $8 billion of cocaine through BCCI, hidden in Siemens transformers transferred to Australia and the USA. And surprise, surprise, it involves all the cartels, Pablo Escobar, Manuel Noriega, and while this is happening, Paul Leah Alexander is acting as an informant for DEA. And hence, you will find that it was all sanctioned. Roy Frankhauser was working and had his office across in Langley with the CIA Counter-Terrorism Centre, but he was an informant for FBI and worked for Nixon, Oliver North, to destroy Lyndon LaRouche, who was exposing Oliver North, Henry Kissinger, Richard Secord's links with dope and drugs and arms. And of course, you will find that the link goes across the Knights of Malta with Peter Grace, Alexander Haig, Henry Kissinger, banker Ambrosiano, and it goes back to the days of Operation Paperclip, where they brought all the Nazis out. And hence, the links of Ted Shackley, Dwayne Claridge, go all the way across to Kuwait. So that's enough of a background there. It's huge. I've done it for 20 years. I've got all the legal documents to substantiate this, records and everything. But the podcast now will focus on the Cercle, the Trilateral Commission, and the P2 Lodge, and the links to the Ambrosiana overseas with Alexander Haig, and the laundering of drugs, heroin with the Gambino Mafia. And so, let's have a look at who Carlo Presenti is, and how did this come about, that he is running a secret Catholic Church organisation revealed by David Rockefeller with Henry Kissinger in their briefing to President Nixon to authorise the funding of CIA for this operation to set up and finance the Cercle 6I as a private intelligence body. Well, let's have a look at what evidence I've got on drugs first. It turns out that Banca Ambrosiano Overseas was set up by Sindona, Calvi and Masinkas, and their attorney, Ralph Seligman, is a 33rd degree Mason. He's also represented all of the links with Mafia, but he's the lawyer responsible for Banca Ambrosiano. And what was the relationship with John Gambino, who was identified as the largest heroin trafficker from Sicily across to the US, New York, with the Gambinos? And how does Sindona tie into Alexander Haig, Stanford Turner, David Kennedy, former Secretary of Treasury, and communicating directly with President Reagan? Well, we have to look at my previous podcast, which talks about CIA's Holy Crusaders. And I have clearly shown that the Knights of Malta is used for money laundering drugs and arms in the name of God. And it went through Americare with Peter Grace, the Moonies, also Wackle with John Singlaub, Oliver North, Richard Secord, Frank Gallucci, William Casey, George Bush Sr., Ted Shackley with the New Right. It was called the Council for National Policy. Richard Viguerie, set up at Leesburg, 7777, the same Leesburg, same address as Eastco, with Ed Wilson, Ted Shackley, Michael Ledeen, Robert Gray, and of course the NED Endowment for Democracy Foundation. And I've already shown that $250 million was laundered from BCCI, laundering Noraga's drugs, was being passed through Pat Robertson's Christian network, broadcasting network, with Capcom, with fraud, stock fraud, precious metal fraud through Chicago Stock Exchange and London Exchange, which I will detail at another stage. I've also shown that categorically that they'd infiltrated the SWIFT banking system, developed all of the fusion and networking protocols, and they were laundering drugs and arms for a Nugenham Bank, Banca Ambrosiano BCCI, and had the partnerships of Gray & Co, Eastco, Operational Systems, Simco, Hadron, and also Computer Power Group with AI, with PROMIS software. But it's been run by Ted Shackley, Thomas Klein, Ed Wilson, and Robert Gray, in partnership with Michael Ledeen, Eric Van Marbod, and Richard Secord. And of course, Daniel Murphy. Remember the name Daniel Murphy? It's coming up in the evidence that we had with Danny Casolaro, flying across to meet directly with Noriega. And Richard Viguerie, who's running this far-right propaganda company and mailing system that can target all politicians and control votes. I also have shown that they had also infiltrated all of the information and command and control systems with the DEA and the war on drugs and terrorism, the command control systems for defence, Pathfinder for following the linkages of drug shipments and drug cartels as intelligence. So they had all the intelligence on moving drugs, and also who the competition would be, and all records of who the informants are and all investigations, and could follow the money, and had infiltrated all the banks. But more important, they had the contracts for the aerostats and AWAC, command control systems for the war on drugs and the interdiction program for intercepting ships, and also aircraft flying drugs in to America, Canada, and from South America and Florida. So they really were the fox in charge of the henhouse. So let's go back now to this secret Catholic group called Sint Unum, run by Carlo Presenti. So the evidence is quite clear that 6I founding member was Lieutenant General Vernon Walters. It says here the man to whom Reagan offered the job within days of meeting with Dementias from French intelligence was someone the French spy master approved entirely, OS veteran NSIC co-founder William Casey. Thanks to Casey and others, NSIC and Cercle's 6I would enjoy unbroken access to the highest levels of US policy making even before the event of Reagan administration, and this occurred during Nixon. As well as having been Reagan's election manager, Casey was also head of Reagan's transition team, particularly in the field of intelligence, where Casey was assisted by two former senior CIA officials as special advisors. 6I founding member was Lieutenant General Vernon Walters, and long-standing ISC friend Ray S. Klein. The agenda for the incoming Reagan administration had to a large extent already been mapped out in a 3,000-page list of policy recommendations published by the Heritage Foundation in January 1981 under the title of Mandate for Leadership. Its intelligence proposal had been drafted by NSIC Washington Chief Roy Godson, Senate Intelligence Committee staffer, and later NSIC IEDSS author Angelo Codavilla, and Crozier's this is Brian Crozier, the founder of 6I, with Vernon Walters, old associate and probable 6I founding member Herb Romenstein. As for the Americans, the most notable participant at the 6I meeting was Lieutenant General Vernon Dick Walters, who served as Deputy Director of Central Intelligence under William Colby, himself a Cercle guest, from May 1972 to 76, retiring 6 months before the first 6I meeting. Fluent in 6 European languages as the result of a childhood in UK, France, Walters would become a veteran coup master involved in most of the CIA's dirtiest operations in Iran, Italy, Vietnam, Chile, Angola, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Fiji, often working with other Cercle contacts. As American military attaché in Tehran, Walters had worked with Kermit Roosevelt and J.K. Young in the 1953 Operation Ajax to overthrow Iranian Prime Minister Mossadegh. From 1967 to 1972, when the Cercle's Belgian base of the AESP was being set up, Walters was military attaché in Paris, responsible for Benelux region. The 6I was a private international agency, in its founder's words, created and funded to bypass the official intelligence services. Brian Crozier reports that he started it with fellow Le Cercle member Nicholas Elliott and then recently retired Deputy Director of Central Intelligence General Vernon Walters, together with a leading figure in major City of London bank, possibly Peter Tennant. At the inaugural 6I meeting, Crozier proposed to Elliott, Hyun, Vernon Walters and other participants to create, quote, a private sector operational intelligence agency, beholden to no government, but at the disposal of allied or friendly governments for certain tasks which, for one reason or another, they were no longer able to tackle. I must make it clear that these tasks did not include any acts of armed force or physical coercion. Don't you like this? Vernon Walters was a deep politician and spook whom Russ Baker termed George H.W. Bush's number 2 man in CIA. He co-founded Brian Cozzi's private intelligence agency, the 6i. Vernon Walters was a United States Army officer and diplomat. Most notably, he served from 1972 to 76 as Deputy Director of Central Intelligence, from 1985 to 1989 as United States Ambassador to the United Nations, and from 1989 to 1991 as Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany during the decisive phase of German reunification. Walters rose to the rank of Lieutenant General in the US Army and is a member of the Military Intelligence Hall of Fame. In the 1960s, Walters served as a US military attaché in France, Italy and Brazil, and in 1961 he proposed an American military intervention in Italy if the Socialist Party had participated in the government. Don't you like that? Right party thinking? While serving as military attaché in Paris from 1967 to 1972, Walters played a role in secret peace talks with North Vietnam. He arranged to smuggle National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger into France for secret meetings with a senior North Vietnamese official, and then smuggle him out again. He accomplished this by borrowing a private aeroplane from an old friend, French President Georges Pompidou. He had previously been chosen by Richard Nixon to be their translator and interpreter during Pompidou's 1970 trip to the United States. So he's number 2 CIA man after George Bush Sr. President Nixon appointed Walters as Deputy Director of Central Intelligence in 1972. Walters also served as acting DCI for 2 months in the mid-1973. During his 4 years as Deputy Director of CIA, he worked closely with 4 successive directors of the agency and the nation and confronted such major international developments as the 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the subsequent oil crisis, the turbulent end of the Vietnam War, the Chilean military coup against Allende government, and the Letelier assassination. According to a close colleague of Walters, also averted a looming catastrophe for the CIA in connection with the Watergate scandal. Don't you love that? According to a close colleague, Walters also averted a looming catastrophe for the CIA in connection with the Watergate scandal, a cover-up. Beginning in 1981, Walters served under Ronald Reagan as roving ambassador. Reagan used prominent Catholics in his government, such as Walters, to brief the Pope during the Cold War. Walters was then United States Ambassador to the United Nations from 1985 to 1989 and Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany, responsible on behalf of the United States for the preparation of the treaty on the final settlement with respect to Germany. So, quite clearly, Vernon Walters is intimately involved in the creation of the Cercle 6i, a private intelligence operation agency outside of government controls in 1970s under Nixon. And he is the key liaison with the Pope. And this part's very interesting. In 1981, for Haig, an advisor on terrorism. And it says here, historian, author and journalist Michael Ledeen is in line to be a special advisor to Secretary of State Alexander Haig, with emphasis on dealing with international terrorism. Haig is said to be unhappy with the US intelligence community's suggestion, counter to his own beliefs, that no convincing evidence links the Soviet Union to the support of international terrorists. Leden's imminent appointment is seen as a way to give the administration anti-terrorist thrust a boost. But Ledeen, the executive editor of the Washington Quarterly, isn't all that thrilled at the idea of being Haig's main man for terrorism. He sees the job as diplomatic in nature and his role as that of a general troubleshooter. Not that he agrees with Haig on the subject of Soviets and terrorists. In a recent article written with novelist Anud D. Borchgrave for the Post, Ledeen wondered why Western intelligence was so unwilling to produce the evidence they possess of an active Soviet role in international terrorism. We can sympathise with the desire of American officials to keep such evidence classified, the article said, but we cannot understand their recent suggestion that no such evidence exists. Ledeen is expected to share an office at State with Vernon Walters, another Haig advisor, though he'll report directly to the Secretary. And so now we have, in 1981, the key, the Cercle, 6I, P2 Lodge, Colonel, key players, Alexander Haig, Michael Ledeen, Vernon Walters. And this is very important because a year later, in March 23rd, 1982, Lyndon LaRouche and the newspapers are exposing that Haig sinks deeper into the Propaganda Due Lodge cover-up, P2 Lodge, involving Michael Ledeen and Alexander Haig. It says here, for the past few weeks, Secretary of State Alexander Haig's advisor, Michael Ledeen, has been systematically exposed by Italian government authorities as being intimately linked to the highest levels of Italian terrorism and the international drug lobby. I'll say it again. Michael Ledeen has been systematically exposed by the Italian government authorities as being intimately linked to the highest level of Italian terrorism and the international drug lobby. Now a second Haig advisor of even higher rank has been implicated, the notorious Vernon Walters, currently ambassador without portfolio, reportedly Ledeen's superior at the State Department. The facts about Vernon Walters were published in the issue of Italian magazine Tu Mondo, one of the leading investigative journals in Italy. In presenting the new facts of the case, Tu Mondo correctly points out that Walters' involvement in the Ledeen scandal has implicated the Secretary of State himself much more seriously than ever before. It says that in February, Ambassador Vernon Walters visited Italy for the sole purpose of forcing a cover-up of the Ledeen involvement with the illegal Propaganda 2 Masonic Lodge, controllers of Italian terrorism and drugs and arms trafficking. Not only did he not succeed, but subsequent revelations have linked Ledeen to the Red Brigade's terrorist gang that kidnapped American NATO General James Dozier. In publicising Vernon Walters' mission, Tu Mondo draws the obvious conclusion that it was not for the purpose of saving Ledeen's relatively low-level neck that a man of Walters' stature risked involvement in the highly dangerous Propaganda 2 affair. Walters' concern in covering up for Ledeen could only be motivated by fear that were the investigations allowed to run their normal course, Alexander Haig personally would soon become emired in the scandal. Haig is already involved. The Propaganda 2 member who had been paying off Michael Ledeen, the socialist Francesco Pazienza, has admitted in testimony in Italian Parliament the fact of his own close relationship with the Secretary of State prior to and during his assumption to that post. The choice of Walters to run the attempted cover-up for Ledeen was apt. Used throughout his career as a high-level and very effective troubleshooter, Walters built up his Italian connections right after World War II, when he was stationed there as a liaison officer between the US and Brazilian armies. Later he was reassigned to Brazil, where in 1964 he coordinated US assistance for the coup d'etat of that year, working through officers who had been with him in Italy. In 1981, he negotiated with Argentine military advisors for the training of Guatemalan death squads on the sophisticated public relations technologies first employed by Argentine AAA. The people under whom Walters worked in Italy in the immediate post-war years, such as James Jesus Angleton, later chief of CIA counterintelligence, were precisely those who organised Italian left and right-wing networks into the Propaganda II Lodge. The members of that secret lodge became the controllers and coordinators of the enormous portion of the international drug and arms traffic that passed through Italy. They also created and deployed the various terrorist gangs. The terrorist connection of Haig's and Walter's subordinate Michael Ledeen has since begun to come to light in greater detail following the ambassador's failed visit. Ledeen has been connected to Luigi Scricchiolo and his wife, Paola Elia, both socialists and high-level members of the Trade Union Confederation, UIL, who were arrested in February under charges of being active ranking members of the Red Brigades, Italy's most infamous terrorist gang. Europa magazine of March 6 reported that Scricchiolo and his wife had contacted Ledeen in the course of 2 trips to the United States. This links directly to the Red Brigades, had issued a communiqué in the period in which they still held dossier, in which they said that the Socialist Party was being controlled from the State Department through an unnamed individual. Antonia Savasta, Dozier's chief Red Brigade jailer, who has since turned state's evidence, subsequently named that the individual as Michael Ledeen. Europa reports that Savasta's information came from the meetings between Ledeen and Scricchiolo pair, Luigi and Paola. Testimony from Savasta and Scricchiolo's own cousin, jailed terrorist Loris Scricchiolo, identified them, and particularly Luigi Scricchiolo, as being the public relations man for the Red Brigades and the liaison man between the Red Brigades, the Irish Republican Army and the Basque ETA. Italian anti-terrorist investigations released to March 10th issue of Italian newspaper La Repubblica that 2 Americans were part of a 12-man commando team that kidnapped and later murdered former Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro in March 1978. One man is already well known to Italian authorities, Ronald Hadley Stark, who among his other activities recruited potential candidates for the terrorist training camps running Gaddafi's Libya. Stark, who is a chemist, helped set up the Brotherhood of Eternal Love in California in 1966, the organization responsible for working with counterculture guru Timothy Leary to produce approximately 10 million doses of LSD-25, quote, Orange Sunshine. In the late 1960s, Stark also maintained a liaison with terrorist Weather Underground. According to federal law enforcement sources, the Brotherhood of Eternal Love paid the Weather Underground $25,000 to coordinate the 1979 prison break of Timothy Leary. French arrest leads into Switzerland. The arrest in Paris in early March of Bruno Briguet, a Swiss national suspected of being involved in planned bombing of Paris hotel, has reopened a trail of investigation into an entrenched fascist terrorist network which has operated in Switzerland with impunity for decades. Briguet is not a new name for European enforcement authorities. In 1970, Briguet was arrested in Israel when explosives were found in his possession, charged with being a terrorist operative for the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. He was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment. Then in 1977 he was suddenly released, whereupon he left Israel for Switzerland to be employed by Genevan banker Francis Genoud. Briguet's association with Genoud was very well publicised. Prior to Briguet's release, Junaid had been openly organising public support committees for Brigitte to plead in behalf of his release. Junaid's own long-term association with the Palestine terrorist circuit were documented in detail in March 7th and 8th in a lengthy feature in France's daily newspaper. As Le Monde reports, Junaid's bank, Banca Arabi Commerciale, was the chief bank used by Algerian FLN political movement during the 1950s and 1960s. Junaid spent some time in Algerian jail in the 1960s because of his suspicions by the Algerian president Ben Bella that Junaid was siphoning party funds out of Ben Benella's control. Prior to his association with Algeria, however, Junaid had been a prominent figure in the Swiss support movement behind German Nazi movement. Le Monde notes that in 1939, Junaid joined ABWA. Despite his Swiss nationality, other European support sources report they are certain Junaid was a close friend of General Wolf, the German commander who oversaw northern Italy for the Nazi Party in the final phase of World War II. Le Monde's expose on Brigitte-Junaid connection is the latest in a series of hard-hitting international probes into the role of Switzerland's banks in protecting terrorist and organised crime operations. Since February, Italian, French and US authorities have been running simultaneous investigations into how Swiss banking system of secret number accounts aids criminality. These official investigations, particularly the French and US investigations, have concentrated on issues of stock fraud, capital flight and other types of white-collar crime. However, the arrest of Swiss terrorist Brigitte and the Le Monde expose signal that law enforcement groups are aware that the Swiss banking system is a protection system for much more dangerous criminals than those perpetrating financial fraud. And it goes on. Lyndon LaRouche successfully exposes that between 1976 and 1981, Walters was officially retired but received enormous salaries for consulting positions, including one with a company called Environmental Systems Inc. He received $300,000 per year. It was a gun-running operation specialising in tanks, laser optical guidance equipment. Another consultancy was with Basic Resources Inc., with Sir Jimmy Goldsmith, or James Goldsmith, a Guatemalan oil operation, on whose board sits the former chairman of Robert Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano, Antonio Tonanello, an Italian-American financier, Robert Memo, the last man to have spoken to Calvi before he was found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London. Ambrosiano was the bank of the P2 Freemasons Lodge, broken up and outlawed by Italian authorities within a week of the first assassination attempt on the Pope. In fact, when Walters returned to government service in 1981 as roving ambassador, it was he whom Alexander Haig dispatched to Italy on the emergency errand of retrieving from fugitive P2 Grandmaster Lucio Gelli the incriminating documents proving that Haig's advisor Michael Ledeen was involved in P2's direction of terrorism in Italy. Ledeen is currently persona non grata in that country. So we really have now got the key people involved with the Iran-Contra, are involved with the Cercle and 6i, that is outside government control as private intelligence agency to create propaganda and remove democratic governments worldwide, and linked with P2 Lodge, Banca Ambrosiana, for money laundering of drugs and arms internationally with fascist organisations. And this is the point where Robert Booth Nichols comes to Australia and says that my problems lead to Alexander Haig, and it was exactly at the same point where I had discovered that Alexander Haig owned a company called Commodore International, registered in Canada and the Bahamas, with the former attorney of Banco Ambrosiana Overseas Limited, founded by Robert Calvi, Michael Sindona and Archbishop Paul Masinkas, the Vatican Bank. The chances of me discovering that and proving that Robert Booth Nichols, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger and Frank Colucci were responsible for the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy the Gough Whitlam government, and links with the Cabazon casinos for the laundering of drugs with Ted Shackley's team, was too much of a coincidence. This is what I found. I found the link of Michael Sindona, member of the P2 Lodge, Robert Calvi P2 Lodge, Paul Masinkas P2 Lodge, and Ralph Seligman, 33 third-degree Mason, an attorney, were all linked directly with Alexander Haig. And David Kennedy, former US Secretary of Treasury, and linked to John Gambino as the leading heroin trafficker from Sicily to New York with the Gambino Mafia. And it came through corporate documents that I uncovered, and also a letter written by Michelle Sindona pleading for the assistance of President Reagan to intervene given his association with Alexander Haig and Stanford Turner and David Kennedy.